In this video, we're going to talk about community ecology. So remember, what is an ecological community? Well, ecological communities are all the living things in an area interacting together. So if you look at this picture of the African Serengeti, you can see obviously there's a lion that's attacked and killed a zebra. So they have a relationship right there. Okay, but there's a lot of others. Obviously, the lion's got a relationship with that hyena. They don't particularly like each other. If you saw the lion, you know that. There's also these vultures out here. They have a relationship with the lion and the hyena and the zebra. So all these different populations interact together in a community, and it's these interactions that are important to understand and how they interact together and how that results in this community ecology. So if we look at interspecific interactions, interspecific means between, intra means within. So intraspecific is amongst one population or one species. There's competition amongst males and so forth, but inter means between species. So we look at species and how they interact. We can see there's a bunch of different interactions. There's competition, like the lion and the hyena. There's predation, like the lion and the zebra. There's mutualism, like a flower and a bee. And there's commensalism. We could say the lion and the vulture have a commensal relation. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, competition, that's a negative negative. The lion and the hyena are competing for the same food, so they don't really like each other. They are directly competing. So they are both sort of negatively impacted by the other. Predation is a plus minus, right? So the lion benefits by having lots of zebra. The zebra do not benefit by having lions around. And then parasitism is sort of another example of that plus-minus relationship, although the parasite is much smaller than its host, but it's a similar plus-minus. And then mutualism is at plus-plus, so a lot of good examples of that, where two species benefit from each other. We'll look at some of those. And then commensalism, this is the one where we said the vulture benefits because the lion's killing things and leaving carrion around. The lions don't really care if vultures are around to eat what they don't, right? So the lion doesn't care about the vulture's presence, but the vultures definitely benefit by having these big predators killing things and leaving dead stuff around. So that's a plus and neutral. Okay. So competition, again, when supplies are short, two species competing directly, again, that's a negative negative when they have the same niche, or if you like French, you could say niche. What is a niche or a niche? That's a role they play. So when they're directly competing for the same role, they have this niche overlap. Okay, and what tends to happen is two species that directly compete have this competitive exclusion principle that occurs. So in other words, if they're competing directly, what will hopefully happen over time, what usually happens is they will find slightly separate niches. So here's an example of two barnacle species. Okay, these guys, the thalamus, their fundamental niche is the intertidal zone. They can live anywhere in the intertidal zone, but they can also live up here in the dry area. These larger barnacles down here, they need to live in a little bit moister environment. Their fundamental niche is down here. So because these two species are competing together, it turns out the larger barnacles can outcompete the smaller barnacles when there's enough water, but they need more water. They need sort of more water in lower tidal zones. So what ends up happening is this species, the thalamus, ends up being in the upper tidal zone where it's a little bit drier. That becomes their realized niche. And then the realized niche of the larger barnacles tends to be the lower tidal zone. So again, they reduce their competition by sort of specializing their niches and finding a place where they can outcompete the other species. And this is a good example of the competitive exclusion principle. So predation's pretty obvious. A predator eats prey. An herbivore eats plants. Okay, hopefully these are terms you're well familiar with, predator and herbivore. And just remember though, it's kind of there is a sort of evolutionary warfare going on. So plants are defending themselves against herbivores by producing toxic chemicals. If you went out into your backyard and tried to eat most of the plants, they'd be toxic. They wouldn't taste good. You'd spit them out. They might make you sick. Okay. Prey species defend themselves by doing things like having good camouflage, fleeing, being very fast, being able to hide, having spines, odors, think of a skunk, toxins, and of course camouflage. Here's a good example of cryptic coloration, where a prey species blends in with the environment and is therefore harder to see. A lot of predators have good camouflage so that the prey species can't see them and they can ambush them as well. Parasitism, again, similar to predation in that it's a plus-minus relationship, but it's obviously characterized by a much smaller parasite and a much larger host. So in terms of parasites, we tend to say we have a parasite-host relationship, and you can think about a lot of those diseases that make you sick are examples of parasites, or ticks and fleas and things like that. Mutualism. So mutualism is the plus-plus relationship. A good example of that are ants and acacia trees. Acacia trees produce this sugar, this honeydew. The ants feed off of that, and because they're getting food from this plant, they will actually protect and defend the acacia tree. So they're sort of like the security that protects these trees, because these trees are providing them food. So that's a plus-plus relationship. Again, bees and flowers are a really good example of a plus-plus relationship. And that's, again, mutualism. Commensalism, this is the one people always kind of forget about. This is the plus-neutral relationship. So this is an example. One species benefits at no benefit or cost to another species. So barnacles growing on the belly of a whale, good example. The barnacles are getting a good spot. They can travel around. They can filter feed off the whale's belly. Whale doesn't really care about the barnacles. Or again, around New Orleans, you see the Spanish moss growing on the live oaks. It's up there, it's getting more sunlight, it's got good spots where it can grow and flourish, and the live oaks aren't really harmed at all by the Spanish moss. So that's a good example of a local commensal relationship. And there's a lot of others you can think about where one species benefits at no benefit or cost to the other. Again, the lion and the vulture was another commensal relation. So again, these predator-prey relationships tend to exist in food chains, and each level of the food chain is called a trophic level. So here you can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 trophic levels, and typically these food chains won't go much higher than 4 or 5 trophic levels. So why only 4 or 5? Well, most of the energy that's captured at each trophic level is lost to the environment as waste heat. So you can see all these organisms are losing most of their energy, and really only about 10% of the energy can be passed on to the next level. So when you get beyond 4 or 5 trophic levels, there's just not enough energy left to be passed on to higher levels than that. So these food chains tend to be limited in terms of the number of trophic levels. We always start with primary producers. They capture energy from usually the sun, photosynthesis, and then primary consumers. Those are also called herbivores. Secondary consumers eat primary, tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers, and so on. So is this realistic, these food chains? Not really, right? We know that there's certainly more than one thing that's preying on flowers, and mice certainly eat things other than grasshoppers. So this is a very simplistic view of how food travels. A more realistic view is to show many interconnected food chains in what we call a food web. So here's an example of a food web. You can see it's very, very complex. There's a lot of different relationships. Sometimes an organism plays different roles. They might be a primary consumer and a secondary consumer. You are that, right? You eat meat, but you also eat plant material. So you're actually feeding at different trophic levels. You don't eat just one source of food, you eat many sources of food. So this kind of shows more the realistic complexity of communities and how many different things interact. And let's just go back there one more time. If you look here, for example, the leopard seal or the small-toothed whale, you can see a lot of things they're eating, and then a lot of things are eaten by them. They have a lot of different roles they play in these communities. And this is a good example of what we call a keystone species. So keystone species are species much like a keystone in an arch that holds the whole arch up. If you remove that keystone species, the whole community crumbles because so many things rely on that species. So let's look at an example of a keystone species. So here is a sea otter. Sea otters eat sea urchins, and sea urchins eat kelp. So out in the Pacific, there are these kelp forests. They're sort of like these rainforests of the marine ecosystem. They're very rich, a lot of biodiversity. And it turns out that killer whales, when they were introduced to an area of the Pacific, and also human hunting for pelts, preyed on and killed a lot of the sea otters. So the sea otter population went down pretty drastically. What happened, the sea otters then stopped feeding on the sea urchins. So the sea urchin population, you can see, went from being fairly low to much higher. Okay. Well, the sea urchins are eating the kelp. So what happened then is the kelp went from high levels to very low levels. And the kelp is the primary producer in this ecosystem. So it's producing food not just for sea urchins, but for a lot of other species. So what ended up happening is a lot of other species that weren't directly impacted by this food chain were impacted because all of a sudden the kelp forests started to disappear because of the overpopulation of the sea urchin. When they reestablished the sea otter populations, everything kind of went back and got in this sort of natural balance. So that's a good example of a keystone species and how if it's removed or if its numbers go down, everything can get quickly out of whack. So let's look at another example of a keystone species. This is in Yosemite National Park out in California. There are cougars, and humans and cougars haven't had the best relationship. So in the 1920s, cougars were basically hunted to extinction in Yosemite, as they were in most of the United States. Well, cougars, their main prey source is mule deer. Now, so what happens? The cougars disappear, so the mule deer population goes up. Well, mule deer are browsers. They like to eat young trees and acorns. So the increasing mule deer population then caused a decrease in the black oaks. The black oaks were a dominant deciduous tree. Deciduous means their leaves fall off in the fall and they bloom in the late spring. Okay, so now the black oaks decline because these mule deer overpopulating are browsing all the new seedlings and eating all the acorns. Well, that then allowed the ponderosa pine, which is a conifer, an evergreen, to move into areas where the black oak once existed. So what happened is this evergreen then started to fill in more and more of Yosemite. Well, what that meant was instead of having these springs before the black oaks leaf out, where sunlight gets into the woods, it was pretty shady, pretty dark year-round. So that meant that some of the flowers in Yosemite weren't able to survive and bloom. They needed that sunlight coming through the deciduous forest in the early spring, and because the evergreens had moved in, they weren't able to grow. So in this case, evening primroses declined, then the bees and the pollinators and the butterflies that relied on that flower declined. So you can see one species, the cougar, declines, impacts not just its prey, but species of trees, species of flowers, and even species of insects in Yosemite. So a really good example of how one species really altered the whole community. Everything changed as a result of that one species decline. Let's look at one more example. So here we have a typical sort of woodland community with hawks and snakes and birds and mice. Well, what happens as what happened in the 30s and 40s when we introduced DDT as a pesticide? It got into the ecosystem and it moved up through food chains, and it basically caused birds to be able to not produce viable eggs. Their eggs were very thin and they cracked and they couldn't produce offspring. So what happened? DDT causes the hawk population to die off. I'm trying to X that out, but my stylus is not working very well. So this guy dies. What's going to happen? Okay. Well, what's going to happen to the mice population? It's going to go up, right? What's going to happen to the golden-crowned kinglet? Well, it's going to go up as well, right? Because these two species are no longer being preyed upon by the hawks. Okay. What's going to happen to the snake population? Okay, well, the snake's got more mice and more kinglets. It's going to go up, right? Okay. What's going to happen to the pine borers? Okay, well, the pine borers now have more birds preying on them. They're going to go down. Okay, what's going to happen to the oak trees? Well, the oaks now are preyed on by more mice. Their population might go down. Okay, what's going to happen to the pines over here? Well, the pines now have fewer of these parasitic insects. Their population is going to go up. Okay, so what's going to happen? If we look at this, we can see that this one species decreasing or disappearing can cause basically the forest to become more of a pine forest